Well, you've been painting only a few months, and you must have the power of the dark gods in your paintbrush because for a couple of months painting, you've done tremendously. Like, and I really mean that. Like, this is super good for a couple of months painting.
Even for like, year, 2 years in, this is certainly a very impressive model.
This is very good.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Critique Clinic, the video series where we give our patrons and you advice on how you can improve your miniature painting.
We have a bumper stacked episode this month. We're doing these obviously monthly now, and there are so many models in this one. So get yourself a tea or coffee. Let's jump in.
First up, we've got Sayadino, who says, I normally paint grimdark orcs, but I realized I was probably using oil and enamel washes as a bit of a crutch. So here's my effort at something with only acrylics. Any constructive criticism is welcome.
Well, what a fantastic miniature to start Critique Clinic with this month. For someone who's used oils predominantly and then moving on to acrylics, I think you've done a really great job. I love the kind of like mustardy yellow tones, also with the shading that you place on there and the volumes and things that you've worked obviously the shadows into. I think it's really, I love the way that it's light around sort of like the face area, just on the gorget and underneath the head. It just adds interest and draws the eye. So I think you've done a really good overall lighting of the miniature.
Really smooth transitions as well, isn't it?
Yeah, they are. Yeah. And I do you know what? I really like the kind of like bitty, kind of gritty kind of feel of it. Like obviously it's got like a bit of a grimdark-esque kind of feel to it, which I think is really nice. I've got to say, the flaming sword, well done. Extra points. It just looks really good. The subtle transition from that deep sort of crimson, sort of like Merlot colour through to the orange, through to the yellow, just works really well. So yeah, overall, fantastic. Things like the script on the purity seals, I think they've done really nicely. I think one thing I would throw into the mix is you've got that scroll just on the crux, Terminatus on the leg. Definitely put some form of name or even just scripture on there as well. I think that would just help sort of unify as somewhere that font would be, so to speak.
You actually get in some of the newer Space Marine kits some really cool transfers. So if you're not confident with your brush skill to get the sort of horizontal script in there, I believe you actually now get some really tiny transfers with some script on them as well.
Definitely, yeah.
Which would be a great way to just sort of embellish that little detail.
100%. And also like the transfers on this, I'm going to throw that in there. They're done really well. Like they
perfect.
Look perfect. So like you've definitely got the ability, whatever way you choose to go, whether it's script or whether it's a transfer, you'll be able to nail it. So yeah, really well done.
You spoke about it already, but the transitions on the armor, I think really work for me, especially because the tones complement the rest, the sort of vibe of the miniature overall, but it adds so much depth to the yellow. I think that yellow is a color that we often see people struggling with, where they go perhaps too bright with the highlights, or you get this like really intense sort of like luminous bright color. But this is just a really nice sort of fairly unique yellow as well.
It's cool. It's like a mustardy yellow. It's really nice.
But it's still like really nice and saturated, and it doesn't like read as this sort of horrible dark brown. You've got the deep dark shadows in there, but it's not subtracting from the yellow. It's still punching through nice and vibrant.
No, definitely.
And the color choice of the edge highlights, I think, actually works phenomenally well.
It's really good, yeah.
And that sort of big jump in contrast, you can see it up here. The big jump in contrast from the really deep shadow to that nice bright edge highlight works absolutely flawlessly. The basing, I think, is really cool for this, sort of stepping through this sort of urban environment, perhaps some road or something like that. But I would say a bit of a pet peeve here, just some sort of like basing material, some paint or something around the toe. I think it's fine to add some like environmental details to the boots.
Yeah,
people
definitely.
say, it's walking through the dirt and whatever, and I totally get that. But to me, this, whether it's the intent or not, just sort of reads as like spilled paint or a mistake.
Yeah.
So I think just tidying that up, it can be difficult. If I'm not sure how you've executed the yellow armor, it might be with the airbrush.
Well, do you know what I was going to say? Like, I think that there's weathering on the miniature. So one thing that I was going to just throw in is like the feet or boots would affect, because they're in contact with the ground, they would be like the most worn part typically on the actual model through natural use of the armor. So you could easily go in there and just weather the feet with the same sort of tones and browns and things you've used on the damage on the armor, or the marks and chips and stuff on the armor. Like, for example, on the left kneecap, you've got obviously loads of little sort of tiny little marks and stuff like that. If you've done a similar sort of thing to that, but on the toe over that sort of like slip of the basing material, it'd hide it really well. And then you could also do it on the other toe as well, just to then balance it so it looks like it's a unified weathering across those two parts of the model. But other than that, I think the model is really well done. It's fantastic.
Yeah, completely agree. Really great work. Thank you for submitting, and we look forward to seeing what you paint next. Pepper Paints Plastic says, hi guys, been in the hobby for just over a year now. This captain is arguably my best work to date. I'd be grateful for some tips on what to work on and how to improve.
Oh boy, here we go. Blood Angels are in the building. Well done. Really nice execution. There are a couple of little things that we are going to talk about across the model. But look, for a year painting, I think you've got to take a step back and go, be really happy with what you've done, because it's really, really well painted. There's a lot of demonstration of skill and aptitude in regards to the highlight stages. A little bit of inconsistency regarding the edge thickness as well in some areas. If you look at the sort of like the sculpted sort of like shin details, some of those edges do vary a little bit, if that makes sense, compared to some of the other edges that are on the miniature. But overall, the cleanliness of the blocking in, I think, is a real testament to your painting for a year's ability or year's work. It's really well painted in the sense of the sectioning, the choice of the separation of color. Obviously, these are flesh tearers. So you've got obviously the black helmet and the black shoulder pads and the black power fist. So it's got a really nice framing of the kind of like the top part of the model, which is done really nicely. And then using white to sort of like accent it on the wings and things. I think it's just really clever. So yeah, really, really great execution for a year. So I think you should be very happy with it.
100%. That being said, though, I do commend your sort of willingness to keep on pushing forward.
Yeah, definitely.
Because we definitely see great things from you in the future, especially.
Yeah.
If that's your attitude now after a year and you're saying, I want to still get better, then 100% we can help you do that.
Yeah.
First thing, just a compliment from me. I really like how you've incorporated the feet into sort of the snow basing on this.
Definitely.
It's really, really nicely done. I think especially the fact that the feet are sort of like sunken in, because you often see with snow basing, people will go, oh yeah, I'm going to put some snow on the boots and then that will help incorporate it. And it does. But to on top of that, have the feet be sunken into the snow.
Look, the guy weighs a ton.
Exactly.
Right? Okay, so
it's just that added level of realism that really, really sells the environment.
Yeah.
And I like how you have added some of the sort of snowflake to the top of the shoe, but you haven't gone like crazy with it.
Even the little spattering, I don't know if it's intentional or done by accident, but even the little grains that are just on the other leg, I think that works quite nicely just to show that stuff is trudging through it, which I think is quite cool.
Yeah, 100%.
I think looking at the back of the model, the main thing really that George and I both came to agreement on is actually the cloth. I think the cloth is the thing that is letting the model down the most. And look, I feel your pain. Cloth for me for a long time was something that I really felt that was like the weakest part of my painting, and something that I definitely would advocate that you do as a real good tip is like before you even paint the model, get a cape and then just take a photo of it and convert it to grayscale, so black and white on your phone. And what that will do is it will show you where light is hitting the cape, the high points, the low points. And that will give you something visual to then go and sketch and have a look and see, right, well, I need to paint highlight here, mid-tone here, and shadow here. I think that's one of the things. The way you've done it and just edge highlighting it, I completely understand, obviously, because that's the way that you approach the rest of the miniature. But like the next point of the journey of painting for you, I think should be starting to use the paint to make different materials on the model read as different materials. I often say it, your job as a painter is to take a plastic model and deceive the viewer into believing that it's metal, wood, cloth, all those kind of things. And you do that by painting it differently and through different stylistic application of techniques.
Yeah, it's with the heavy metal style especially, it can feel like a bit of a one-size-fits-all kind of way of painting. But I think that cloth is especially where we see a lot of people getting tripped up with that.
Yeah.
And I think even before we talk about like the highlighting method on this, I think black is always a difficult color to paint, but I think getting away from using just flat like grays and things like that is a really, really helpful way to help it read more as cloth, because you're just going to have a lot more different variants in tone and colors, but also especially because it's got black armor panels on the rest of the model. I think that's why it's sort of, like you said, a little bit of a letdown by comparison, is because you've got a black backpack and black shoulder pads literally right next to it, and they're painted in the exact same way. It's just why you're sort of getting tripped up there a little bit. There's a whole bunch of techniques to look into in approaching that. Wet blending, glazing, feathering, all of the above. We've done a podcast episode previously on sort of blending methods and where it's best to use them, so maybe give that a little bit of a listen. But otherwise, like you said, James, I mean, it is really nicely executed across the whole model.
Yeah.
But I think just practicing, I mean, even if you haven't got like loads of models to practice on, I think your first attempt at something doesn't have to be the final attempt at something. So even if you've got this model, I know for a fact this I know for a fact that this cape comes off as a separate piece. So maybe not attaching it when you're in the build stage, leaving it as a separate sort of sub-assembly, having a practice of painting it, learning what you can, and then either painting over it or stripping it, or just trying to tighten up and refine what you're doing as much as possible.
Yeah.
Because especially when you're early on in painting, a lot of it just comes down to practice and repetition. And especially when you're working with new techniques that you haven't done before, your first attempt isn't necessarily going to be the best.
No.
And unfortunately, when you're painting on other areas of the model is like fairly experienced by comparison, you've done quite a bit of edge highlighting on Space Marine armor, you've done quite a bit of blocking on that sort of stuff, but you've never really done any like wet blending or feathering or anything like that. It's going to feel like a lower quality level than the rest of the model. So it's just about trying to bring the hours of those other surfaces back up to where everything else is at, because we're seeing some really, really great skill on the power armor and things.
Yeah.
And even on like the metallics. It's just about putting in the reps as much on other materials as you are on the armor.
Yeah, so overall, really great execution for a year's painting. I hope all that feedback really helps you. I really, really like the model, obviously, but I think that you just need to take that feedback on board and really sort of like tighten up on a couple of little bits and bobs across the miniature. And also, don't be worried about painting cloth. It's something that just takes some time to get used to and how the light interacts with it.
Columbo says, hey guys, couple months into the hobby, started out on a Chaos Space Marine combat patrol. Here's my take on a Master of Possession. Tried to copy the box art as much as my skill allows. Would be thankful for any feedback on improving this particular mini and things to work on next.
Well, you've been painting only a few months and you must have the power of the dark gods in your paintbrush because for a couple of months painting, you've done tremendously. And I really mean that. This is super, super good for a couple of months painting.
Even for year, 2 years in, this is certainly a very impressive model.
This is very, very good. And like I said, it just is really, really important that if you're just copying box art, it's really good that you're using that as a linear kind of if it looks like that, I know my painting will be X level, if that makes sense. And I think you've done great with it. So yeah. Where to go with it? Well, I definitely think that one of the things that we always talk about is consistency of things like line weight and stuff like that when it comes to the edging. Now, you're clearly a proficient in attempting sort of double highlight stages, so you're chunky desaturated and you're sort of more vibrant, sharper. I think one of the things is, obviously, look, the model is very impressive overall in the way you've executed it, things like the fire, the glow effects and all those kind of things. But I think when you really dive in and look at it at a more granular level, I think it's actually making sure that the line weight is super consistent. And I think the biggest thing I can say to you is that really, really tighten up on the refinement of your edges and just your highlighting in general across the model. It's very, very good, but I think that you really should focus on just being as sharp and as neat as physically possible with regards to every line that you execute on there. I think that's the best advice that I can give you for this from looking at it, because you've done, and I really mean this, you've done a great job on the miniature.
Yeah, I completely agree. And unfortunately, it's probably not what you want to hear, but the way you get better at doing that is purely just with hours and time and practice.
It is, yeah.
I think that the way you're approaching the edge highlighting is clearly very, very good, especially for how short of a time you've been painting.
Yeah.
So I don't want to give you too much steering in terms of the technique specifically, because I think you're just so early on to be able to sort of really nitpick that. However, I do think it's just a time thing. And we can see these inner edge highlights sort of next to the trim are very, very difficult.
Yeah, they
and
are.
Getting them smooth and sharp, even for a very, very experienced painter, is very difficult. So it's just about spending the time there. But, the natural textures, I think, look fantastic. With the cloth, you've got some nice blending, some really nice deep shading in here as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Really, really great contrast levels. And it does read as a box art style paint job, definitely. I think the main thing is as James said, it's just the refinement of those edge highlights. But personally, I spend hours and hours and hours edge highlighting. Even just a leg, especially when it's very intricate like this. So I think it's just about spending the time and just taking your time and sharpening up that brush control as much as you can, especially early on in your painting journey, being at this level already. Some amazing potential from you, and I really look forward to seeing what you do in the future. But I think just practicing that brush control and getting the edge highlighting tightened up will be really, really fundamental, I think, to your improvement overall, because having that brush control isn't just useful for the edge highlights. It's when it comes down the road and you need to do some tiny little details like some teeth on the Space Marine.
Yeah, of course.
Or, painting some eye lenses. That brush control is quite rudimentary, and it will translate to other areas of the model.
Yeah, I think the one of the big things, I think, also just to touch upon it, is you're being really bold with color, which I think is something that we always try and convey and tell people. The jumps in color between your highlight stages have a really good scope, as in you're not doing super close jumps, you're doing quite bold jumps, which I think translates to a really high impact, high contrast model. I think with black specifically, one thing just to be, I'll just give you a bit of advice to err on the side of caution, not being too stark with the highlights. I think one thing that obviously your sort of thin or your most vibrant highlight on there is quite close to white. It looks like it's blue horror or something like that. I probably would recommend doing something more like Incubi and then Thunderhawk and Fenrisian. You'll still get vibrant edge highlight stages, but they won't look as stark. You really want to avoid black objects when they're lit by light. They don't really have harsh, super vibrant white highlights. It's only on really sharp apex kind of corners and things like that they do. I probably would say just tone down the highlights a little bit. It's great that you're bold, but when it comes to black armor, I wouldn't be finishing with like a close to white or pasteurized color. That's probably the biggest bit of advice I could give you on this.
I think circling around on that advice though, I think the placement isn't too bad. It's it's just due to the sort of coverage and the overall surface area.
Yeah.
I think once your brush skill does improve and you start getting sharper with those highlights, and you can make those highlights physically smaller.
Yeah, of course,
I do think that will work quite well because the placement I think is okay.
The placement's great, yeah.
And we can see that you have done, you know, the soft highlight and then the sort of middle edge highlight and then the brighter one on top. I think being, like James said, just a little bit more selective with where you place that brightest highlight, I think could see quite a nice sort of jump in terms of quality.
Yeah, definitely.
But otherwise, I mean, as we've said it already, for where you're at in terms of the amount of time that you've been painting, this is phenomenal.
It's great.
Really it's amazing to see. We look forward to seeing what you do next. Please submit it. We look forward to picking it apart.
100%.
Carol says, hey guys, just started with painting 40k and taking it more seriously. Looking to see where I can improve, especially with OSL and painting black armor. Looking forward to some feedback.
So this Black Templar is actually really awesome. The whole vibe, like when I talk about grimdark and like that it's a mood or vibe, this model for me really sells that. Like it's a clean model. It's got some great technical execution on it, but but the vibe that it portrays and the vibe that it gives me is very much that kind of grimdark feel. So yeah, I think it's awesome.
Yeah, completely agree. To your point, like we've said about grimdark, how it doesn't necessarily need to be something just caked in streaking grime or mud or something like that.
Yeah, I agree.
You've gone really nice and like subtle with the sort of weathering and
mud
environmental effects, I think, because like you've tied the feet into the basing nicely, but even just having some little like subtle, like little bits of rust and stuff on the helmet, I think works really nice because it's subtle. I think it's done really, really tastefully rather than just going like absolutely crazy with it.
Yeah, 100%.
And there's even some subtle...
I love the cape.
There's some subtle bits on the cape as well.
The cape is awesome.
I would say you perhaps could have gone a tiny little bit more contrast with the cape, perhaps some tiny little flecks and bits of mud on the very tips.
Definitely, yeah.
Subtly.
Yeah.
I think would have been a nice way to sort of elevate that a little bit. But overall, like the mood of the piece is fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to touch upon the thing that you asked about initially, which is obviously the OSL. I've got to say, I think you've done really great with it. It's lovely and subtle, but also where it's emanating from is lovely and vibrant. I think that you can push the contrast more. And I think actually the glow effect on the actual cape, maybe you can probably leave that as it is, but I would, in the center of those squares and each of the little bits of the brazier, I would just go slightly brighter and it will really sell the point of origin of the light source. If you wanted to glaze some of the folds a little bit more with that next brighter stage, I suppose you could, but only subtly just to increase the vibrancy and saturation a little bit. Same with the plasma. I wanted to talk about that. It's still OSL at the end of the day. You can see it's glowing. It's got a nice subtlety to it, but I think you can really use that efficiently to draw the eye to that detail and pump the contrast up higher on it, definitely.
Just some bright spots, I think, like in the depths of the coils and just sort of this bottom line along here. Just adding a tiny little bit brighter. Yeah. But like be careful because I think like subtlety is really, really important in miniature painting. And 100%. Overall, your painting style is so tastefully subtle, I would be apprehensive to get away from that. Like try not to lose that.
He's not going to disco, but definitely I think that you can just notch it up a little bit more to draw the eye.
Tiny bit. I actually think more so with the plasma than the sort of torch that you've got here. I think this works really, really nicely.
Yeah, it does.
You could go a tiny bit brighter, but I think that the plasma is asking for it a little bit more than this is.
Well, I was going to say, like, because the eye lens has got a little glow effect on it, and also the plasma has, and the brazier, you've got a nice triangular shape between those three. So if they all slightly increase a little bit, you'd have a really nice triangular kind of point of interest, a focal sort of triangle on the model, which I think would work quite nice.
But I think you kind of got like opposite ways to execute that. So with the torch, you've got the bright spots are sort of in the center.
You can make it dark.
And the recesses are darker. I would say you kind of want to flip that. So with the plasma coils, you want the part that's closer to the light to be brighter. So that would be actually in the recesses on this. And similarly with the eye lens, I think if you could just add like a nice little bright like line just in that recess there.
Yeah.
So maybe treating it almost as a subtle wash.
Yeah.
And just, again, subtle, but just adding a tiny little bit more brightness in there for the sort of hot spots, I think would work really, really nicely.
Yeah. There's only two other little bits that I wanted to comment on this, and I think there's things that I think that would add quite a lot of interest. So the first thing is the leather, the belt. I love the fact you put like this recess of like this orangey, like muddy, rusty tone in there. I think it's good, but I think that again, you've got a little bit of it here, obviously in the belt as well. As much as I'm assuming this has been like a wash that's supplied or something, I'd be really careful about getting it in the leather because it kind of makes the eye not read it as leather. It looks more metallic because it's got that almost like a rust kind of color there. It's just something to be conscious of. What you could do just to break it up is you could obviously just paint all these skulls silver, so they're actually a metallic detail. And then if you wanted a rust around those, that could potentially work. But I'd leave these exterior parts of the belt, leave them as brown, so they do read as leather, if that makes sense. The other thing I just wanted to comment on was you've got these beautiful little details, especially on this kind of like ancient armor, the rivets and things like that. You've also got on the model, you've got these rivets here, a couple of rivets on the gun here that you can paint. I think those little details on those, because it's a more desaturated palette in some areas, I definitely would recommend that you add a bit of brightness with some metallics. Things like this jack port where like a chapter surf would plug into the armor, I definitely would add metallic on there to add interest to it. When you've got such a big, bold black scheme, adding little details on like these rivets, the jack port and things like that will just add a lot of interest. Same for the skulls, as I mentioned up here on the belt. So that's the things that I'd probably recommend you do.
Yeah, and I think I can see from just sort of punching in that you've done some very subtle, soft edge highlights, which I do really like, and I like how subtle they are because I think you can tend to desaturate black quite quickly by adding like fairly harsh light greys and whites.
Yeah.
I think just to add some more visual interest subtly within the style that you've already gone for, I think would be just some very, very soft like sponging or some sort of side of brush,
like
dry brushing and chipping, just on some of the really, really sharp edges, very, very selectively, not everywhere. Just some like bright silvers where like some of the paint might have chipped or something like that. So
Definitely,
on like side of the hip plate here, top of the knee, maybe a tiny little bit on the top of the sort of part of the helmet here and on the tilt shield. I think little things like that would add a lot of visual interest because, again, it's nice and subtle and I really do like that. But these are very, very flat black areas otherwise.
Yeah, definitely.
You've got the nice sort of orange tones in there from the rust and stuff, but I think just adding some highlights, I think would go a long way. Very, very selectively, and I think it would fit the sort of mood and style of the piece as well.
Yeah, definitely. The last thing I want to just chuck in there, because we've not that we're overlooking it, but well done on the blade. I think the blade looks great. I love the kind of like blending you've done on there, just the real sort of sheen of a metallic that you've done there. I think that's really nice. Or the energized blade, it looks really good. Perhaps consider potentially the actual node, painting that a specific color, just so it draws interest to it. You could do it a red, you could do it a green, or something like that. It would just add a bit of interest to the power node and just really sort of like draw the eye to the weapon as well, which I think is quite cool.
Yeah, but otherwise really, really nicely and smoothly executed. Love the style. Fantastic piece. Invictus Lampada says, I need to work a little on the edge highlights, most notably on the boots, but would some volumetric highlights on some of the armor panels help or be too much?
I absolutely love the Aquilon models. I think you've done a great job. The overall unit altogether looks really awesome. So well done for creating a great, impressive squad. Extra props for the little mini turret as well. That's an awesome little model. So in regards to your sort of like your questions about the sort of like the edges, I think you've actually done quite a good job on the edge. You know?
Yeah, I agree actually.
I think that, again, there's lots of sharp edges. I think there's the odd edge that's maybe a little bit thicker than some others or whatever. But I think if you just really be conscious of that, I think what you've done on the models looks fantastic, like genuinely.
I think some of that as well just comes down to practice. It's like you're already doing the right things. It's just like putting the reps in, so to speak.
Amen. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think, like I said, they look great. Like, I think the color choices are good. But I even love the basing. I love the fact you've got like this woodland kind of
it's really nice,
reddy toned base. It works really well with the blue and like the sort of desaturated sort of copper and that. It just, really, really well done.
We'll grab one of these to punch in and then we'll look at it under the microscope. I wanted to grab this one first of all because I think it's a nice kind of representation of a sort of average of where the squad is at in terms of painting. Really, really nicely blocked in.
It's super neat.
It's
honestly.
really, really neat, which is so nice to see. And we've said it time and time again, but like really neatly blocked in miniatures always works really well, even if they are fairly simple in terms of techniques used.
I tell you what, that copper trim on the grav shoot, I tell you what, you can do my skirting board if you're doing that. That is super, super duper neat, which is great.
Yeah, especially on that sort of top edge as well, which I think a lot of painters would miss because you kind of paint that with the side of the brush and you might get a little bit of bleed on the top there.
Yeah, everything looks highlighted really nicely. I said, like you asked about the highlighting. I think like there's a little bit, tiny bit of variance in your thickness of your edges, etc. But I think overall, like when you've got a unit and they're all painted to this standard, they look fantastic, like really, really do. And it's just a case of just putting in a bit more reps with like the brush control to get the edges as sharp as possible, both with side of the brush and pull stroke highlights. But if you look at those leather straps, the edging you've done on those on there is great, like fantastic, like really well done.
If I was to go off a bit of a hunch, I could be wrong, but I feel like perhaps some of the line weight inconsistency on the blue edge highlights might be due to the paint just being a little bit too thin.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is because we can see from the browns that you are quite capable of doing a fairly sharp highlight and that being a different paint. I feel like you might have just over-thinned the blue slightly. I could be wrong.
Potentially,
so don't go too far the other way with that advice.
No.
But just maybe be conscious of that because when you're painting, obviously a thicker paint wants to flow more. So when you're touching the surface, is sort of wanting to wick off. If you thought of this in really extremes, if you had the brush was just soaking wet, you can't paint a sharp, precise point with that, right?
No, exactly.
Because it just wants to sort of just mop off onto the surface. So be conscious of that. Maybe just experiment around with paint dilution and see if that helps you with edge highlighting. I think one thing that would have been nice to see as well is just a tiny little bit more contrast on the plasma.
Yeah, I agree.
Especially because it's blue against blue, which I think is absolutely fine. But I think I can see some like bright sort of icy blue, almost white highlights in there.
Yeah.
I think if you'd applied that almost as just like a wash over the top of this, just so that sort of pooled and collected in the recesses where the light is brighter.
Yeah.
I think that would have sold the effect a little bit more. So I think maybe play around with that.
Or you could have even gone darker on the upside down U with the coils. So you could just do the side and the flat of the top slightly darker, and it would actually force the eye to look at the bottom being brighter as well, which I think it'd make the eye read the bottom being brighter, which I think would work. And again, I'm just going to chuck it in there. That you've had that blue on the brush, the little like sort of like screen thing that he's got in his van brace. You could have just chucked blue in that central hole in the middle of it, and it would just made that read like a little dial or screen or something. It's always good to be efficient with the paint. If you've got a color on the brush and there's a little screen button dial or something you can add it to add interest, it adds so much value to the miniature in the sense of the details. So I'd probably recommend that as well.
So now, I just wanted to discuss, and I'll pull up another example of this in a moment, is just the way you've executed the skin and the sort of skin tones and the way that it's been painted. So I noticed that you've used presumably a wash over the skin, which is absolutely fine. But I think something to be conscious of is just how much of that wash you're applying, and potentially look at thinning down the wash and doing it in multiple coats rather than maybe one heavier coat. So if you look at under the sort of cheekbone and where it's just sort of gone into the ear, I'm starting to see a little bit of glossiness.
Yeah.
And that is a sort of a classic sort of trait of applying a wash over the top, because gravity, it's all sort of flowed down and then sort of collected in that area. I think it might just be a little bit too much. I think you've gotten away with it on this head just fine, but on some of the other examples that I'll show, I think it's a little bit too intense.
Yeah.
So I'd consider maybe just thinning down the wash on the palette, adding a little bit of water in there, applying it, and then doing another coat afterwards, and just sort of concentrating it more in the darker areas. But one thing I actually like that you've elected to do is some advice that I gave previously, which is if you're speed painting or if you're perhaps lacking a little bit of confidence in your brush control, just omitting painting the eyes. I think this is a really good example of how, especially at sort of arm's reach, you can't really tell that the eyes haven't been painted.
No, you're right.
And it's not actually hurting the paint job. But using this face here as an example of just what I was speaking about with that wash pooling. And it's leading to inconsistencies as well. So you've got a lot of shading on one side of the nose, whereas you haven't on the other.
Yeah.
So obviously gravity has sort of sucked the paint away, and perhaps where you've sort of left at the end of the brush stroke, it's sort of concentrated the wash in perhaps some areas where you wouldn't want it. So like I said, just spending a little bit of extra time on the face, because it is the focal point, and the rest of the miniature is so nicely painted, it would be a shame to just sort of rush through that part.
No, definitely. I think, just like George said, if you just go a bit thinner with the overall sort of tones that you put on there, again, like faces are very subtle. Unless you're like really, really old, you've got loads of crinkles and recesses and stuff like that where shadows can cast from light coming above. The complexion and the overall sort of tone that you've gone for, there's like lots of patches that are really, really dark. And I think it makes him look older, So yeah, give him some rejuvenant treatment and just lighten the face a little bit potentially.
Otherwise, as we've already said already, a fantastic squad. It looks really, really great, especially when you see it all coming together. And we look forward to seeing what you paint next. Angry Raven says, I really wanted to focus on techniques and points given from a previous mini I submitted to Critique Clinic. I really enjoyed pushing harder and definitely feel that I improved. I would really appreciate some more feedback and suggestions on what I can focus on for my next character project.
So I am really pleased to see you submit this next miniature to Critique Clinic, purely because it's been really great to see your progression as a painter, not only from on here, but I think you've been on a couple of classes with us before. And from seeing your progression of painting, it's great. Really sharp. I think the highlighting is great. I think you've done really nice on highlighting, obviously, on the pads. These inner and outer pad highlights are super sharp, which is good.
Nice to see the inner pad highlight as well. That's a shortcut that people often make.
Yeah, that other side edge is really good. And even on the gorget on the neck, that looks great as well. But yeah, overall, like really, really awesome. Raven Guard, obviously, Shrike as well. Even the highlights on the center of these sort of grav veins here that you can see, the central ones. And it takes a lot of skill and brush control to actually sharply edge highlight.
It's almost flat, isn't it, that panel? I mean, there's a tiny little bit of sculpted angle, but it's very subtle, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm gonna throw into the mix one little thing that I'm not gonna let you get away with, which is the drilling of the barrels. Come on, you got to get those barrels drilled. And Shrike has like grenade launchers or like smoke launchers punctures on his backpack, being all stealthy as he is, and etc. So get those drilled as well, just so that they've got holes in them. But
it adds a lot of credibility, doesn't it?
Yeah,
when
it does.
You
It makes
it
it look functional, which I think is really important, especially when you've got like all the background and stuff to the models. But I've got to say, yeah, like really, really phenomenal. I think the miniature in itself, I think the only feedback I would probably give is that in some of the areas of the edges, there's a tiny bit of inconsistency of like the thickness, but it's so marginal, and I really would say, I think that all the progression you've been doing from miniature to miniature and all the submissions you've had, it's been fantastic to see your progress, and you've done really, really, really well.
I think one of the things that's good to bear in mind with their trialing as well is some of it does just come down to putting in the reps and the practice of doing it. You can be doing all the right things, but it's just getting that fine control with your hand. It's just sort of a muscle that you've got to train, really. So again, you've got some nice sharp edges here. As James mentioned, there are some that are a little bit more wobbly than others, but I do think that that's less down to technique and more just down to practice. I think if you crank out, a few more of these, you're going to get that sharpened up quite nicely. To your point, James, of drilling out the barrels, I think another sort of building and cleaning thing to note is I can see a mold line that I believe has been scraped, but maybe not smoothed perfectly.
Get the Tamiya sanding foam on the go.
Yeah, sanding foam is something that me and James are big fans of, especially for curved areas like this. It really is invaluable. Get yourself some 600, 800 or 1,000 grit. We like the Tamiya sanding sponge. You can check the link in the description for some of our recommended products. It's really, really nice for smoothing out areas like that because a scalpel can't quite get that contoured edge. You leave a bit of a flat spot on a knee panel like that. So try out the sanding foam. And I will say, of course, bonus points for the brown base rim.
Oh, George. I am going to chuck a couple of extra little things in here because I really think that like the model, obviously a black color schemed model is obviously like his hair is black as well. Just as a little sort of additional thing, and this hopefully helps out a lot of people, is that like obviously his armor's black. You've used the same sort of highlights on the hair as the armor.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really would recommend, even on like the feathers, so there's a few things on here that I would probably recommend you highlight with different tones. And I'd probably maybe go more like inky darkness or blue tones. Like, you don't have to go like blue hair. You can still be like a really dark color, but just adding a different hue. Think of a crow or a raven, the colors they have when light shines on them, it's a bit more iridescent. So you have like blues and purples and things like that. Now, maybe don't go down the route of purple, but like especially for like the feather of the that's obviously he's got on the pistol, or maybe the one down here on his hip as well. I'd probably use bluer tones, and you could probably do that with the hair as well, or use different grays. So visually the colors are different. The other thing I would comment on is actually his Crux Terminatus, which is here, or the sort of icon that's hanging from his waist. I'd actually paint this gold just so that it breaks up all the different colors that are around it, and it adds a bit of warmth to the model as well. Look at how lovely this red here looks on this sort of trim, and also on the little lens on the arm here. I think if you put some gold here, for example, it would just really focus that detail, add a lot of warmth to that part of the model. And the beauty of it is if you do the feathers blue on the waist and have blue tones, you'll have a lovely blue-yellow color relationship with the gold being yellow next to it. So I think that would look quite good.
Yeah, adding color in subtle ways like that to a sort of otherwise fairly monochrome miniature, I think is really important. And you have done it with the shoulder pads, so adding a little bit more visual color on sort of the bottom right corner of the model.
Definitely.
Would be nice to kind of draw the eye as well, because my eye is quite sort of drawn into that
It's
red.
drawn to the red, yeah. So you have a nice diagonal kind of like visual interest on there.
That would work really, really nicely.
Yeah.
And to your point of different colors for the blacks, just experiment with other black recipes like James said, but bear in mind you can also just use other paints.
Yeah.
So even if you're going to use like similar grays, just using different paint, it makes the surfaces look different.
Yeah.
Because at the minute, the only thing differentiating this gray from this gray is the sculpting and not actually the colors used.
100%.
So just be conscious of that and maybe experiment around with some other black recipes.
Yeah, but that's super granular feedback. But again, got to say this: every submission you've put in here, like your progress has been fantastic. So really well done.
I would say the nitpickiness of this feedback is a testament to your skill.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
take that as a compliment.
Definitely.
Jukos says, just started in the hobby roughly 4 months ago. Would love to get some feedback on ways to improve. I feel that this is my best mini so far, and I'm wondering how to move forward from here, as I've decided to attempt commission painting when I feel ready.
So for 4 months painting, I've got to say this, I think the model is fantastic. And there's a lot of actual little things which show not only accuracy, but just understanding, which I think is really good. And for 4 months, I've got to tip my hat to you because that's mega.
100%.
You've done absolutely mega. Really, I think overall, I think one of the things to just take away from this is that I can see the flesh, for example, has been dry brushed and things like that. Nothing wrong with that at all whatsoever. I think one thing to start looking into is maybe you could still do a combination of stippling, like we've said in other bits of feedback in this episode. But you can do sort of like stippling on the skin just to be softer, so you're not doing as much friction on the surface. Or maybe if you want to soften down the dry brushing you've done, adding on a glaze will just soften it and smooth it out a little bit, which I definitely would recommend. I love the fact you've got great color relationships on there. You've got obviously the green of the warpstone, you've got the pipes, all the green kind of energy stuff, you've got the sewage on the base, and then you've got
the sewage looks great, by the way.
Yeah,
like, let's talk about the basing for a second.
Yeah.
I mean, like, the wood reads as wood. You've got some like cool like toxic slime sort of going on here.
Great.
Some bubbles and texture, which I think is like quite intentional, just sort of show that this is got some flowing and some movement.
Looks great.
To it. Looks really, really cool.
I wouldn't go swimming in it, but it looks good. But it looks good.
Yeah, to your point with the skin and stuff, I think maybe even just experimenting around with doing like a solid color and then just some contrast paints or some washes over the top, because I think that you've got a lot more smoothness in the sort of red armor panels and some of this sort of cloth than you have on the skin and the fur. So I think just experimenting around with how to tackle those textures, and maybe I think I personally prefer the way that like the red armor panels and the metallics and the cloth looks to the skin. Again, that's just my preference. But while dry brushing can be quick and really, really fun, I think perhaps something as textured as this that's got some really nice soft volumes already, I think for me that's kind of begging for a wash or a contrast paint. As opposed to like a dry brush.
Yeah, definitely. But I got to hand it to you, because like, again, even with all those things, you've been painting 4 months. Like, look at the accuracy of like how you painted the eye yellow. That eye is like perfectly painted, like framed really nicely with some shadow. Like, it's really well done. You've done a phenomenal job of the warp stone on the chest. It's like edge highlighted as well. You know, so it looks really, really good. I think you've done a great job. Like the metallics, you've got edges on there as well. So for 4 months painting, you've done mega. So like, you should be really happy with it. And I completely concur. Like, if this is 4 months of painting, this is like a great model. So really well done.
Yeah, I think in terms of future tense, it is unfortunately when you're that early on in painting, especially, it is just about putting in the reps. We can see that you're quite more than capable of doing some nice smooth base coats and blocking things in nicely.
Definitely.
So I think just take on board maybe some of the things we said about washes and the dry brushing. And consider that for your next model. But otherwise, I think you're at a point where it's just about cranking out more models and just getting some more experience and some practice.
Get the reps in.
Yeah, but some really great potential with this piece, and we look forward to seeing what you paint next. Roysonkin says, greetings. I've been painting for roughly 9 months, mainly Stormcasts and some Gits. I've been gifted the mini I'm presenting, and I wanted to challenge myself. It's the first time I'm painting this much skin and flames. I also spent a bit more time on the base.
So overall, model is really, really great. I love how clean all the blocking in is. Like, for 9 months painting, blocking it in that competently is really good. Like,
smooth base coats as well.
Yeah, it's really important. Everything else is built upon it. So like the hair, the beard and stuff, even though it's not got maybe loads of shadow on it, but like it's super smooth. So really well done.
Especially with white, we see a lot of painters struggle, especially early on, in getting nice smooth base coats. And something like this, which has got some fairly subtle sculpting on it. They're quite shallow sort of recesses.
They are, yeah.
So to see a nice smooth white base coat across all the beard and there being absolutely no texture is really, really spot on.
Yeah, done great. I think also the comprehension, understanding of flames and painting flames correct, like the point of origin or point of like ignition being brighter and then trading off, going through oranges into black or like a mauve color at the end, is you smashed it. Really, really well done. Looks fantastic. I actually like the accuracy on painting the eyes white as well. You put these tiny little white dots in the face, and I just like your accuracy for 9 months of doing that is fantastic. So well done. Really, really well done.
Yeah, perhaps the next step with that would be graduating on to sort of getting the pupils on there as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, 100%. Flesh as well. Like flesh, you've done a really nice job of just shading it and doing a bit of highlighting on it. Again, there's nothing wrong when you're starting out painting and you've been doing it 9 months. Using washes and all that kind of stuff just to get stuff painted, and you can see how the paint behaves and flows is perfect. And I think again, you've done a really great job with the flesh as well.
100%. I think simpler is always effective.
Yeah.
Regardless of what skill level you're at, and especially when it comes to turning around models reasonably quickly as well. Kind of regardless of your skill level, I think painting simple flesh like this with just sort of some washes or some contrast paints and things like that, I think is perfectly valid. And it looks nice and smooth, and it looks like skin. So what more do you need?
No, 100%. Yeah.
I think in regards to the basing, I think this sort of lacks the subtlety and smoothness that the rest of the model does, just sort of by comparison. And I don't mean in terms of like the details necessarily, but this has been quite heavily dry brushed with the greys. And I think that's quite intense compared to the rest of the model, because you've got this really nice sort of smooth look.
Yeah.
And then this very, very grainy, every tiny little bit of sand is picked out sort of thing. So I think just going a little bit softer in a literal sense with applying the dry brushing to the stone, just so it's got a bit more sort of unifying aesthetic to the rest of the miniature. I think it would make it kind of fit in its environment a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. I've got to give you props as well. You're so keen to get a photo in. The base trim is still drying. So yeah, well done. But overall, fantastic model. I think for 9 months painting, you've done amazing. So well
100%.
done.
Sovereign says, first time competition piece. I put extra effort into highlighting the metallics and tried to do some layered glazing to shade things like the molten metal and hazard stripes. Also used some extra dry brushing to try and bring up some of the battle damage on the Dreadnought wreckage.
So this is really cool as a piece. I think first and foremost, the composition is great. You've got a lovely triangular shape on it, which is really good. It focuses the eye to the actual model. So you look from the base upwards, which I think is quite cool. It's a really nice sort of shape. I think overall, colours really good. I think you've done a great job with adding interest to it in various different ways. So fantastic execution in the sense of the overall look of the thing, which I think is good.
In terms of, you said this for competition, I think it's really, really great to see community members like getting ready for more competition painting. We speak about it a lot.
Definitely.
I think kind of regardless of how you do in the competition or anything like that, it's really, really great way of pushing your skills forward. I think just having that in your head that there's a date I've got to get this done by, and it's going to be looked at and scrutinized by other people. Just having that in your head the whole time while you're painting really, really does translate through your hands, and it makes you like look at your miniature in a new way, which I think is really, really great for improving your brush skill. I personally have seen a lot of improvement through entering competitions over the years. Again, nothing to do with like the accolades or how you do in the competition itself. You could almost effectively not actually put it in the cabinet. It's just that the time up until that point of the date. It's
getting yourself in that mindset of I'm trying to paint the best I can. I think that helps massively
100%.
with your painting.
Yeah, so I think you said about doing some dry brushing and stuff like that. I think for me, I like the sort of, Iron Warriors really sort of dirtied up, and then you've got the sort of sand and those colours, the oranges really complement the blues on the miniature, which I like. I think that you need perhaps for this sort of, it's kind of like this sandy sort of Martian earth sort of look. I think it's trying to read as sort of dusty and sandy.
But it's very shiny.
But it is quite shiny in terms of its sort of finish. And I think as well, it's just lacking a little bit of that sort of oomph that you get from some sand and things. So I would actually say, as a starting point, just taking the piece already as is and experimenting with some powder pigments, I think are really, really great for stuff like this.
Yeah.
And you could add those to the actual sort of basing sort of orange sand itself to give it just a bit more of a dusty look. But then also perhaps using some other tones and bringing out some of the weathering in the Iron Warrior sort of sarcophagus itself as well.
Yeah, I mean, you could get like a much brighter silver and just sponge or stipple with it on there just to catch some of the edges and stuff, just show like it's a bit dented and chipped and damaged. I think that would work quite well.
Yeah, because we've got these sort of like pock marks and stuff sort of in the armor panels already, which are shaded, definitely. But it's just adding some extra visual interest. I think you could do the same with like some bright yellow patches on the hazard stripes there. And again, like you said, some different metallics and whatnot just to bring out some of those edges, because you've got like a really nice, harsh, sharp edge highlight, which I think is great. But it's just adding some more visual interest to the sort of flats of the surface, because otherwise they're very, very simple.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the thing that caught my eye that I wanted to go into a bit more detail about is actually the hammer and the blood effects on there. I would definitely say that you want to make it look more like a splat rather than like maybe he's dipped it in like porridge or something like that. It's a little bit looks like he's dipped the hammer into something and it's like hanging on to it rather than it being hitting something and causing an impact and splattering. So things like sponging the blood effect on works quite well. You can obviously get a paintbrush and flick it at the model, but then if you don't want to get blood all over the model, that's fine. He's not a worshipper of corn by the looks of it. So I'd definitely go on with like being a bit more subtle with the way you actually apply the blood effect onto the hammer, and just be really gentle with applying it. Just gentle sponge work, just to add on like a sort of like more of a splat pattern to it. And you can go in and still put like streaks of blood and stuff like that with a brush, some sharp lines of him, like where it's like gone off in different directions. I think that for me, that's the thing that's like getting a little bit lost in the rest of the model. You've done some really nice kind of like weathering effects and other bits and bobs on the models, but the blood effect doesn't read as blood, if that makes sense.
I think one thing to bear in mind as well, purely because we're speaking about this in terms of like competition entry, just in regards to the composition, I think that if you are going to go with the blood effects and things like that, I'd maybe be conscious of where else you've got these sort of dark reds on the miniature.
Yeah, definitely.
It can kind of draw the eye away from that. So I would maybe consider, regardless of whether this sort of goes with your army scheme or whatnot, because I think we've seen some previous entries from you in this color scheme, maybe consider just going with some more neutral colors for those like leather tassels. So maybe just black or something like that, or
brown
or brown like leather, just to give it a bit more contrast in terms of color choice from the hammer, and it will make that blood effect kind of sell and pop just a little bit more, because there's not red directly next to it in terms of the silhouette. But otherwise, a really cool piece. Let us know how you get on in the competition.
Definitely be interested.
Yeah, and we can see some great improvement from your previous entries. So keep it up, and we look forward to seeing what you do next. Okay, Paul Nickel has painted an Eversor Assassin who says, my first ever attempt at OSL for some feedback.
Great model. I think you've done a really good job with the model overall. I think the color choices are really good. I love the fact you've got a complementary green and red scheme, obviously neutral tone for the skull. So lots of really cool colors that are on there. Obviously, you've done a bit of an OSL thing on here. We're going to talk about that a bit more in detail. But yeah, overall, I think really neat. Great section in, obviously, all the different details on all the skin suit, the armor, all the metallics and things. So yeah, overall, really, really well presented model.
Yeah, on James's point, like we've said on previous episodes, the neatness of blocking in different details is really, really important, just so that you can. It's like think of it like a coloring book, staying within the lines. It seems like
without an airbrush.
It seems so simple, but it is so important for conveying the smoothness of the model overall as well. I think one of the positive points I think is just sort of the skull helmet, face being the focal point, or the helmet being the focal point on any miniature. Really, it's nice that you've put some thorough detail and attention into that and the smoothness. One thing that I often see, which is a bit of a pet peeve, is people just sort of caking wash over skulls, and you typically see that sort of pooling on the top, sort of domed part of the head, which the reason I say it's a bit of a pet peeve is because that adds shading and shadow to what would
be the
brightest point. You've not done that, which is fantastic to see, and the shading is actually nicely concentrated in sort of the recessed part of the teeth, sort of on the side of the head, like the temples as well.
Yeah.
And you've got that nice smooth highlight as well, and the bone overall is like a nice bright but like warm sort of color as well. I think it works really nicely, and it contrasts the rest of the miniature nicely and makes it stand out even more as well.
So you've asked us about the OSL, and I think that the decision to make that little detail a light is really cool, by the way. I've never ever thought of doing that as a light personally when I've seen the model, so that's really interesting that you've done that. So obviously the OSL is coming from here, which is great. I think that the actual, and let's just talk about, before we talk about the model, let's talk about the actual point of origin of the light source. I think you've done a great job of actually showing that is where the light is coming from, obviously. But I think that there's details and things around it which aren't catching the light at all whatsoever. Obviously, when light is exiting an object in that manner, it hits everything in 360 degrees around the object. If you look at this pipe that's above it, because it's the volume's a cylinder or the shape's a cylinder, so you would have a linear highlight on that. You can almost see a highlight, natural light hitting it anyway on this bar here, but there's no red glow on the underside here directly to the light, and it would have that. So you need to put OSL on this, or like a glow effect on there. Also, please also remember that it gets brighter towards the point of origin and more diffused and subtle or further away from it. The Eversor being further away than this bar would theoretically mean that it's obviously going to be brighter on the bar here, on this pipe work here. And the back shot of it, you would have a little bit of light subtly creeping round onto the back of the calf as well. This is a lovely cylindrical shape here that you can see, and you would have a little bit of light just creeping round from the point of origin. It wouldn't be a flat green as you've got it there. You can almost look at the way that light is hitting this naturally on the model. You can see this lovely plane here, this bright volumetric highlight all the way down the cylinder of the leg. You'd have red just creeping around here. You've kind of done it here in this sort of like the join here on the leg a little bit. And obviously, the other thing I was going to say is the underside of the claw. So each one of these blades, these facets here that are flat to light, something is always brighter the flatter it is to light. The more angled away from light that it is, the less it will catch that light. So these blades, whether it be the underside of the claw, as in not the facets that we can see in this picture, the actual undersides of the claws would probably catch the light the most, and then light would subtly creep and bleed around those and diffuse more around them.
On that point of like diffusion, it's thinking as well, like in terms of distance.
Yep.
So the closer we are to this light itself, the brighter it will be. The further away we are, the more subtle it is. And I think that subtlety, is the thing that is hurting the effect of this overall. I would say it's very, very intense in the surrounding part of the red light, arguably more so than the light itself.
Yeah, definitely.
And then you've got an equal sort of part of saturation quite far away from the object as well.
Yeah.
So it's just about dialing it in and going really, really subtle with it, because I think it's easier to add more and it's harder to kind of take away. So I think when you're doing OSL like this, start off really, really, really subtle and just start creeping it in. And you need that contrast. So, you think in your head, I want to make it look like everything's glowing. The only way to do that is to do less of it, because you get quite excited and you want to add more and more and more, but it actually ends up kind of hurting the effect. So really just concentrate on making this light as bright as possible, making it really, really bright, vibrant red.
Yeah, agree.
And then just subtly adding it around in the surrounding areas. And then think about distance as well. So I would argue that like the model should barely really be catching anything with a light like this because it's not that intense.
Yeah.
The surrounding part of the sort of wall that it's mounted to, I think makes a lot of sense. I think it just, again, needs to be slightly subtler, and then perhaps some subtle red glow on the sort of the opposite side to the leg that we can see in this photo.
Yeah.
A little bit on this metal part here, as James said, maybe a tiny little bit on the claws as well. And then kind of that's it for me.
Yeah. Again, it is also situational. So we're taking it at face value. That's just a wall. If hypothetically this guy was running down a tunnel or a pipe or something like that, like whatever, because of the darkness caused by that, the glow effect would be obviously way more because light emanates.
But then equally, the rest of the miniature would be darker.
Correct. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
So we're taking it 100% at face value that it is just like a wall or something that's left over in like a ruined city or whatever, but the case may be. So from this angle, definitely. And the last thing I'd say is this line that you've got of the lighting effect, it's way too harsh. It needs to be way more soft and muted and diffuse outward, so it'd graduate away from the light as opposed to being like a stop point, if that makes sense. On the front, I think, again, you've done where these are softer. It's really good that you've done that. They are softer, but also a couple of little things. I think on the calf, it's the flattest and closest angle to the light, so it would maybe be a little bit brighter here. One thing I think you'd definitely consider is changing the color of the knee pad armor from red to something else like black, because then it will give you the ability to actually put a little bit of a glow effect on there. The red kind of like, I think that's what's throwing it for me.
It's quite difficult with the green as well, because them being sort of opposing colors already, and you've got the red light shining on green glow, it's going to kind of eat up some of that light anyway.
Yeah, 100%.
So I think maybe just experiment with color choice a little bit more, because I think this could have worked a lot better perhaps on a different scheme, even if it was applied in the exact same way.
If you've gone down the route of a black skin suit, like the stereotypical black skin suit, and maybe not and done the light a different color to red so that you could use that color of light over the red kneecap armor, and then maybe even on sort of like the skin suit plus also any red armor details, you could have done like a blue light or something like that, and it would have just worked maybe better on the piece because it's a color that's not involved with like the armor on the model or anything else, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's just a contrast values because we're comparing sort of red glow on red surfaces.
Armor. Yeah,
that's all. But overall, like I said, it is really nicely painted. The basing's really neat as well.
Yeah, really cool.
All the details on it. There's some other photos which we'll put up as well. You painted some really cool effects on the vials of the weapon as well.
Yeah, the choice of purple is fantastic. Really good, harmonious color.
Yeah, but I think great attempt on the OSL. We look forward to seeing what you do on the next one.
So we've got Shalaxi, a really cool demon model from the Slanesh Age of Sigmar range. Really, really cool model. I think what you're trying to do here with the balance of dark and light is really cool. I think the placement of the light, we can talk about a few things that you can do with the light placement. But for me, obviously, the main thing when your question was obviously just about texture and also smoothness. So yeah, we'll tackle that as well. I think first and foremost, your color choices on here are really good. I love the lilacs and sort of like the turquoise kind of color combo that you got with that lovely rich gold. I think they're really inspired sort of choices when it comes to the color palette. The use of white and black on the headdress as well, I really do like that. It's super high contrast and it really defines and frames the overall faceplate quite nicely, which I think is good. So when it comes to the flesh, I think one of the things you asked about was obviously just the smoothness of the flesh and also some glazing as well. We'll talk about those two things independently. But with the flesh, first and foremost, I really do like the fact that you've kind of like focused the lighting effect on the center mass of the model. I think that's cool. I think there's another area which you could focus the light on, which I think George is going to go into a bit more detail on. But with regards to the actual execution of it, I think one of the biggest things that many painters sort of like, you're so focused on actually painting in the miniature, creating texture on the surface of the model is mainly done through friction or overworking. And I think one of the things that maybe is a little bit demonstrated here is that some of the highlight stages or some of the highlighting does have a more of a granular look to it, purely because I think that there's been a lot of working of the areas to get the vibrancy and create sort of like the interest and transitions and things. If you look here, for example, there's like texture on the sort of like inner arm, for example, and there's a little bit in some areas in some of the parts of the brighter pieces. Really be conscious of the fact that you're using a brush, whether it's synthetic or whether it's like a Kalinsky Sable or whatever, you are creating friction. It's something you don't visibly see while you're painting, but being softer and more gentle with your actual pressure that you're applying the brushes will translate to smoother miniatures and just helps mitigate overworking and roughness on a miniature. In regards to that overworking as well, it's not just about the sort of level of intensity and friction you're applying, but it's also about being conscious of drying paint. Yeah. And you don't want to be like adding abrasion to paint that is drying. The paint dries so quickly anyway, it's always worth it to just wait 20, 30 seconds after a brush stroke 100%.
Before going back over that area again, because when you're brushing, especially when you're trying to do blending and glazing as well, when you've applied the brush stroke, it's half sort of dry and you're going over it again, you're sort of destroying and tearing up some of that surface underneath it. And then when you're trying to use that as your sort of blending medium in a way, so you're mixing like half dry paint in with wet paint, and then moving it around on the surface. And that's when you're creating that sort of like gritty, like paint crumb sort of texture.
Yeah, it's something that we're super engaged with what it is that we're painting, and it's kind of this thing that's happening, and like you're innocently unaware of it, you know. But it's something to really be conscious of while you're painting. Like sometimes it's better, like if you've done a layer or something, just leave it and let it dry fully. You can always soften it, tweak it, darken it, whatever. But just disturbing the paint you've applied sometimes has worse results than just letting it dry and then dealing with it once it's dry, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if you've made a mistake, just wait and let it dry. Let it dry completely.
Yeah. With regards to the glazing, obviously, like I haven't seen the sort of the dilution that you're using on your palette, but like I always say that it's better to be way thinner. So like for me, a glaze is like water tinted a hue of the color rather than a thin paint. It shouldn't be like semi-opaque, or it should be completely translucent but hold inherently a tone or color of the paint you're using. That's what a glaze should be. And the beauty of that is that there's all different strengths of glaze. You can have a really, really weak glaze and a stronger glaze, of course. However, if you're trying to really build things up softly and smoothly, doing multiple thin layers of a glaze and drying them on incrementally and seeing what they do to the surface is going to give you a much more controlled execution, and in the long run a smoother execution, because glazes inevitably are like a polish. They just help smooth out any little imperfections and things. I think one of the things noticing on your skin is that a lot of the lighting effect on there, the striations and brush movement that's visible in there, and again, that brush movement and brush strokes is totally a stylistic thing. If you want it to be smooth, then obviously glaze the living hell out of it. If you're doing it more painterly, or you don't mind so much seeing the brush marks, then that's fine. But I'm guessing from the way you've explained it in your question that you want it to be smoother. So what I would definitely say to you is that like really focus on not creating loads of brush movement on the surface, and then that will hopefully translate to a smoother finish for you.
Yeah, and I think if you do want to be a bit more heavy-handed with it as well, I would say one of the techniques to look into that I think would work nicely with this style would actually be stippling.
Yeah.
So I think if you've got the model to the point that it is at already, have a look for there's some great videos on YouTube. Have a look at some stippling techniques, and just using that to sort of soften and feather out some of these blends. Because I think that adding those dots and all that tiny bit of texture is going to kind of help smooth out and give you that kind of like painterly look that we talk about.
Yeah.
But in a sort of smoother gradient in terms of the transition from the shading to the highlights.
Yeah,
but I think actually the highlight placement, I think, is actually pretty much spot on with this.
I think it's
just that transition from the shadow to the light.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, 100%. I think you were going to talk about as well, I think that the lighting effect, even though it's on the center mass of the miniature, I think like you've said it many times, and we always talk about it, like the head is the focal point of the miniature. I think it'd be really good to see a bit more of vibrancy on the face, because the face has a much more desaturated, darker, moodier kind of look. And whether that's intentional, that's fine. If you want it to be obviously that way, that makes perfect sense. Whereas obviously the lighting effect you've done is mainly on the center mass, like the chest area and the front of the arms and stuff. And I think that if you maybe brighten the face a little bit, it would really create more of a focal point on that really important detail, which is the head or the face of the miniature.
Especially when the headdress is quite bright as well. You've kind of got this sort of letterboxed midpoint here, where there's not a lot going on. And I think the problem with it is less so to do with the contrast and more to do with the fact of just a bit of a loss of detail.
Yeah.
So you can see everything fully everywhere else bar the face. And like we said, the face for me is always going to be the focal point, especially when it's a sort of humanoid look to it. So I think just adding some highlights on like the cheekbones, perhaps painting the eyes as well, and even on the chin, it will just add, a similar lighting effect to the rest of the model. But like I said, I personally would want to be drawn to the face. I personally would have sacrificed going a little bit darker on the torso and the headdress and making the face brighter, whereas I argue this is kind of the inverse of that. It's just something to be conscious of. Like I said, that's obviously opinion based, and that's entirely up to you.
It's purely a stylistic choice. Obviously, if you want the torso to be the main part, that's totally fine. It's no problems at all.
Overall, though, it is a really nice piece, and I do really like the really high contrast look that you've gone for. I think it works really nicely, and the color choices are great. It'd just be nice to see some tightening up in terms of the smoothness of the blends, but otherwise, really great miniature. Joel Ralph has painted a Tzeentch Changeling, and they say they want to see some improvement, and they don't think they managed very well on the smoke under the body and his right hand, and they want to make it stand out more.
So overall, I think the model is painted really well. I think the blocking in is done really neatly. I love the use of the purple to kind of like blue on the weird snake fish thing coming out the head of the staff. I literally don't know what else to call it. The gold trim on the model is also really nice and vibrant. So you got good contrast between those two details.
Looks like some nice black lining actually as well between the sort of cloth textures and the gold trim as well.
Yeah, the shading's been done quite nicely as well. I think for me, like the cloth is the one thing that like is a little bit off in the sense of some of the highlighting. I think that like remember that it's always the angle away from light that has shadow. It's not whether it's deeper or higher. It's purely down to the fact of the angle. If it's flatter, and arguably the higher points tend to have obviously a more flat tops. If you look, for example, at the top of these funnels here, where you painted it bright is correct, but then having deep shadow in here, this bottom of this trench is still flat to light, so it actually catch the light because it's flat. It'd be this sideboard here and up as it gets to the flatter part where it would go from darker to brighter, and then obviously the brightest on the top here. So I think it's a lot of people put shadow in the actual recesses, which I know gives high contrast and immediate sort of like wow factor, but it's actually not correct in how light interacts with fabric or materials that have folds and things like that. It's always the angle that determines the vibrancy.
I think a way to quite easily sort of pick that out before you get started with painting as well is zenithal undercoats. So if you have a rattle can, you can do it, or if you have an airbrush, you can do it. And it's basically just spraying from a 90-ish degree angle, just straight down from above with a contrasting color to your undercoat. So for example, you could just prime the model a dark gray or black and then just spray straight from above with white. And what you actually see with that is because light can't curve, it only travels in one direction, right? So
spray, literally. Like
exactly.
Spray,
so if we've got light coming from a source like up above here in the top left, and it's firing downwards from a sort of 90-ish degree angle, you would see, like James said, that all of these facets here would be nice and bright and blue, but the shading, rather than being in the actual recess like you would maybe do on like a heavy metal space marine armor, it would actually be this sort of whole plane here would be shaded. Mm-hmm. So we see that correctly done on the sort of inside of the cloak. It's sort of
because light can't get in there. Yeah,
exactly. But it's just sort of applying that universal lighting principle to the rest of the miniature. It just makes it a bit more readable. I think even when you can't necessarily put into words why a model doesn't quite look right, your eye can still interpret it in that way. So it's just having an understanding of how light works and behaves, because you need kind of universal principles for the whole miniature. You don't want light behaving differently on one area of the model as it does on another.
Yeah.
You want just kind of this unifying way that the miniature is shaded and highlighted, and it can make it look a lot more sort of credible and readable. Yeah,
definitely. I think like the smoke that you're speaking about, obviously, one of the things I always say is like have a look at like just Google image search like fire or smoke and stuff like that, and see how it actually the vibrancy where it goes from darker to light. Like normally, the point of origin on a fire is the brightest point, and as the flames go away, they obviously go darker, and then the ends will be like turning into like black and soot and things like that. With smoke, you have a really nice, more subtle effect on it, and I think that I know what you've tried to do here. You've got like a bluish tint to the smoke, which kind of works with the overall color palette, because obviously it's Zinch and you've got those blue tones and things like that. So the turquoisey smoke kind of looks cool and magical and that kind of stuff. But I think what you really need to do is like make it sort of like add some variants of tone in there, but maybe doing like some of the more higher points or more tighter points, doing brighter. Just choose some areas to make brighter and darker. And you need more, overall, you need more tonal variants actually on the smoke to kind of sell it as if it's billowing and sort of blooming, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I will say to your credit though, it is always really, really difficult with sculpted smoke and fire and things like that hard, on miniatures. Yeah. It's always going to be difficult because it's never going to quite look right, even when it is painted in a certain style.
Definitely.
But I think perhaps even just adding some more contrast, just to sort of pick out the volumes as well. Because everything's looking, I'd argue, like reasonably flat, and maybe just having some sort of gradation, like James said, maybe towards the tips it gets a little bit darker, and towards the center mass it kind of keeps that neutral mid-tone that you've got, and maybe just adding some shading in some of those like dark recesses as well, kind of like what you actually have done up here with the cloth, but just sort of applying that to the smoke as well.
Yeah, definitely.
But overall, it's a really nice miniature. I mean, it reads very Zinch, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's great. I love the snake fish on the staff. I think that's amazing. So yeah, and you can definitely move colors and blend colors, because you can look what you've done there with the purple and the blue. I think if you do that a bit more with some of the other details, like the smoke, for example, I think you'll really be happy with what you do with it. So Giles also submitted a space wolf. Looks like a lone wolf by all accounts, with the two wolves with him. But really, really awesome, sort of gritty, grimdark kind of feel. I love the way that it looks like he's on the hunt, which is awesome. Obviously, I know you've done a little bit of sculpting on this, on the beard and things like that. I think it's like billowing there in the wind, which is quite cool. And I did actually really like the kind of like free-handed markings. It's like he's put his own markings on his armor, which is really fitting with kind of the space wolf vibe. But the composition in overall is really cool. I love the
It's got nice movement to it as well, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of, those sort of old video games like Crash Bandicoot. You're sort of looking from it front on and they're kind of running towards you.
Yeah.
Got that nice dynamic movement there with the wolves and also the Space Wolf as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, you mentioned in your note for this one about the markings and trying to make them look hand painted rather than sort of machine painted or something like that.
Yeah.
Which I do think actually comes across quite nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool composition, as we said. I think maybe the intensity of some of the blues for like the ice and sort of water is maybe a little bit harsh.
Yeah, potentially.
Maybe settle that down just a little bit. But otherwise, cool piece. Zeno has painted a customized Jain Zar, and they say, I do like how she came out, but then again, I'm inexperienced.
So I don't know if this model is 100% finished yet or not. So I'm going to obviously have that caveat in there. But I think what has been done so far is actually really good. There's some really nice smooth application of paint across the model, whether you're looking at the tassels or whether you're looking at the bone armor or even the gold. I think they're definitely really good foundations that have been applied, which then obviously you can do more to, like, for example, adding more contrast, brightening areas, highlighting, or just maybe increasing the pin shade a little bit in the deepest parts with a deep shadow. The hair, definitely, I think like there's some obvious highlighting that's been done on there, but I think you can almost add a bit more and also add some more shading to sort of like the more shadowed parts, and it would really sort of like help sell the hair is like dangling and with like the light not hitting it in all areas, for example.
I think the highlighting is actually fairly smooth there. It just needs a little bit more depth in terms of the recessed areas.
Definitely.
So adding just like a simple wash or some glazing over the top of that, I think would be really, really nice. And to your point as well, like it is nice smooth base coats over like the bone armor in particular. And I think the gold as well. Perhaps you could add some additional sort of shading to the gold. One thing that I like to do when painting gold is rather than just doing like one all over wash, I'll do it in sort of multiple passes. Yeah. So starting off with a fairly thin wash and then going back into some of the deep recesses and applying a more concentrated wash to those areas.
Yeah.
And then again, to James's point, I think perhaps this is somewhat unfinished down here. But with like the basing, I think one thing that's just such an easy win is to just go around the base rim with a scalpel and just clean up the base rim, get it nice and smooth, sand it if required, and then just painting a nice smooth base rim. Mm-hmm. It really just finishes off the miniature and it frames it really, really nicely.
Yeah,
regardless of your color choice. I think it's just that final stage that just lets you know that something is done rather than 100%. Kind of like in progress.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah, but definitely some potential here. And as you said, you're fairly inexperienced with painting. But otherwise, I would say you've got some great potential that we've seen here. Definitely. And maybe submit some future models, perhaps when they're finished as well. Well, that's it for this month's episode of Critique Clinic. We hope that you've enjoyed the longer format of episode, and we've really, really enjoyed looking at all of your miniatures that you've submitted. So a massive thank you to our patrons for doing that. If you would like to submit your miniature for a future episode of Critique Clinic, then check the link in the description of this episode. There'll be a link to our Patreon. And in addition to Critique Clinic, you'll also gain access to hundreds of high-quality PDF and video tutorials. So check the links down there. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you next month.
Thanks so much. See you very soon.